Hi, everybody. You're listening to It's All About Food. I'm your host, Karen Hartglass. Thank you for joining me. We're going to dig deep into the mind and our thoughts and our consciousness and ethics today, okay? My guest is Dr. Jonathan Leighton. He is an ethics strategist and social change advocate. He is the author of The Battle of Compassion, Ethics in an Apathetic Universe, in which he takes a methodical approach to answering the question, what matters? Tying in findings from physics, biology, psychology, and philosophy. Since June 2016, he is the executive director of the Organization of the Prevention of Intense Suffering, a Swiss think and do tank he founded to promote the application of compassionate ethics to societal decision-making. OPIS has been advocating for better access to effective medications for people in severe pain, including patients with terminal cancer or cluster headaches, and more generally for governments to prioritize the prevention of intense suffering of all sentient beings. Originally from Montreal, Canada, Leighton trained as a research molecular biologist, obtaining an AB from Harvard University and a PhD from the University of Basel. He has worked as a scientist studying the molecular basis of olfaction, as well as in global health and biotech communications. He is one of the leading proponents of a contemporary approach to ethics that focuses explicitly on the prevention and alleviation of suffering. My guest, Dr. Jonathan Leighton, is talking with me from Greece. Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
It's a real pleasure. Really happy to be on your podcast.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. I discovered you on Facebook on, I think it was the Reduce Insect Suffering group. And it's not something that a lot of people think about, reducing insect suffering. And I read a lot of interesting things there. So I found you and I learned that you had a new book out, The Tango of Ethics. And also that you had created this organization for the prevention of intense suffering. So you piqued my interest, and I'm really honored that you're taking the time to speak with me. I'm very interested in you and your work and talking about suffering and how we can prevent it. Let's start with you and who you are and how you got onto being interested in reducing suffering, especially intense suffering. And then we'll get to your book.
Okay, well, I guess in a sense, it goes back to some of the things I was exposed to as a child, not personally, but in elementary school, we were shown scenes, video footage and photos of what happened in the Holocaust. So, and I think, partly because of the particular disposition I seem to have, I was particularly affected by a lot of these images. I have no idea how some of my classmates at the time were affected, but a lot of these images left a lasting impression on me. And I think somehow they influenced my feelings about what I wanted to do with my career. Now, initially, my plan was to go into biomedical research. I had this idea that, since my aptitudes were very much in a scientific direction, I thought I could have an influence on the world by, studying cancer and maybe finding a cure for some forms of cancer. But eventually I found that, I did a PhD, but it was not actually in the field of cancer research. Partly for personal reasons, I ended up doing my PhD in Switzerland in a lab that was studying other things that were, in the end, less related to human health. And I found myself drifting farther away from the things I cared about. Doing some interesting things in industry, in the perfume industry, actually, trying to understand how the sense of smell works. But eventually, I was drawn back to this core idea of, what do we do about suffering in the world? And at some point, I basically decided to drop what I was doing professionally, which at the time was working at a communications agency in Geneva, and working on subjects like biotechnology and global health. And I really had two objectives. One was to write a book and I already had a lot of notes written down, and I wanted to consolidate them and take the time to work on the book. That ended up being my first book, which came out in 2011. And I also had the idea of starting up my own organization that would put scientific ideas into practice so that we can become more effective in preventing and reducing suffering in the world. So, that really, in a nutshell, was my trajectory, at least until the point where I decided to basically go off on my own and do my own thing and really focus on what I was passionate about.
What I'm curious about is why your story is somewhat unique. There are not many people who, as a child, see something, make a connection, and then later in life feel they have an obligation almost to do something about the issues that they've seen that appear wrong. And I'm choosing my words now, and I'm not doing a very good job because I read your book, The Tango of Ethics, and I'm realizing there's a lot of semantics and what do we mean by everything, and we really should be careful about choosing what we say. But we'll get there later. Don't pick on me. I didn't have a similar story, but I remember when I was young. I'm curious to read your book, The Battle for Compassion, now, because you talk about what matters. And I remember as a child thinking, what matters? And does anything matter? And deciding that really nothing mattered. And then, but I was here on Earth, so I would make things matter and try and do the best that I could and be nice. And maybe even apply the golden rule, which you talk about in your book. And I also have a background, not the same, but I studied chemical engineering, and I went off and did some chemical engineering and realized that, that's not what I was about either. But, a lot of people don't get to that place and don't see truth, then don't want to face reality and go off and live nice lives. And those are the people that have a relative amount of privilege on this planet, because then there are the others that are just in survival or they're suffering, and there's all different ways lives can go. But I'm just curious, for those of us who have a reasonably nice life and food to eat and options and education, why we don't go this route of wanting to reduce suffering.
Well, first of all, I mean, I would argue that, and I'm sure you would agree, actually, that there are a lot of people that do devote a lot of their time to philanthropic causes, people that that work for charities, for NGOs, or people that decide to give away some of their earnings as philanthropists. So I think people are affected to greater or lesser extents by suffering in the world, and just because I'm focused on the concept of suffering and digging maybe in some ways a little bit deeper ethically, doesn't necessarily mean I'm having more impact than countless other people that are really doing essential work on the ground, whether it's helping humans or animals or creating organizations. But in terms of what really drew me to this subject and to try to explore it in a deeper way, I mean, part of it is, I guess, just my personality, just this curiosity, but understanding how things work, which I guess I've had since I was a kid. I wanted to understand how the world works, in the really big sense. And once I sort of felt I had an understanding in terms of basic mechanisms, which I talk about in The Battle for Compassion, looking at things through the lens of evolutionary psychology and evolution more generally, and the fact that we just evolved on this planet as a result of random processes, and suffering got thrown in to the mix because it was evolutionarily useful, and and humans compete with one another for status and cooperate, and a couple of sort of very basic principles can explain a lot about how the world works. And then the second question was, well, given what we know about how the world works, how do we decide what our priorities should be? And this has ended up being, well, it was partly the subject of my first book, and it's something I developed more in my new book. And I've given myself the time to do this. When I quit my last regular job, it was almost like, I describe it sometimes as jumping out of an airplane and having faith that there will be a parachute that will open before I hit the ground. And I seem to have, I wouldn't recommend it as the most secure career path, but I'm happy I made that decision, because it really allowed me to, in a sense, compensate for not doing things earlier that were really aligned with who I am and my values, and then giving myself the time to really explore in depth this very basic question: how do we decide what our priorities should be? And give myself the time to think about it, and then ideally try to put these ideas into practice.
I just want to go back to the people, the kind people out there that are doing good things and are donating to charities and doing philanthropic work. I appreciate all of that. There's a certain amount of closed-mindedness where even if we're doing good things, we don't want to see everything. We feel good about doing some good things, but other things we just want to ignore. And okay, that's just the way it is. And when you talk about value, how do we value the work that we do? And is your work better than my work or somebody else's work? And is somebody more effective? You talk about value in the book too. I don't know that we know how to really attribute value to anyone's work. So what I wanted to say just about your book and why I'm glad you wrote it, you may not agree with me, and that's okay. But I kind of think that there's some sort of global consciousness, and just you thinking about it and putting your thoughts down on a page makes it accessible to us, whether we read your book or not. It's there, and that's a good thing.
Well, thanks. I mean, I definitely, I wrote the book with the hope that there would be some impact. Considering the amount of time that went into it, I mean, way more time than I ever expected. One of the ideas in the book is to, one of the ideas I tried to propagate is this old idea from that was expressed by Gandhi, to be the change you want to see in the world, and to serve as a kind of a model of how you would ideally like more people in the world to be. And I'm not claiming to be some kind of a model in that respect, but this is actually one of the core ideas. Well, there are many ideas, of course, that I develop in the book, but this is one of the ideas that I communicate towards the end, is this idea of being the change you want to see in the world. And it's really based on this idea of how do we spread the right kind of ideas. I mean, even determining what the right ideas are is very difficult, but just the basic idea of compassion and kindness and trying to have impact, I think, are some basic core ideas. There's nothing very original about them, but my book is, I guess, one more vehicle for these ideas to spread. And of course, there are other themes in the book, and one of the key ones is impact. I mean, impact is really ultimately what I think ethics is about, and this is one of the core themes that I focus on. There are many different ideas about ethics, and three of the main theories are virtue ethics, which is more about how to be a good person, which is more about character. There's deontology, which is about what kind of rules do we want to follow. And then there's consequentialism, which is really about measuring impact. And I mean, okay, now we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty of what I write about. I don't try to frame things in terms of right or wrong, or what we should do or what we ought to do. I think that it can be a distraction, and I don't think it's always the most rigorous way of looking at things. So I try to avoid that kind of framing. But what I do say is that if we want to change anything in the world, then we need to somehow measure the consequences of our actions. If all our thinking about ethics is divorced from actual change in the world, then it's not very useful. So ultimately, I think ethics is about impact, but we can follow rules to try to be more impactful, because Sometimes it's just a lot easier to follow rules that have been well thought out and to try to make decisions individually in every situation. And then I would argue that, what does it mean to be a good person? If we're really concerned about labels, which I don't think we should be, but if, what kind of character would we ideally like people to have? Well, to care about the well-being of others, other humans and other sentient beings. So I think that these three different, let's say, categories of ethical thinking are actually very complementary. And ideally, what we want to do is see how we can respond to urgency in the world, suffering which has urgency, which cries out for action. And so, you're talking about value, and this is really one of the big questions in ethics, which is what has value. And there are many ideas about what value is, and you were talking earlier about the problem with language, and what I think has happened in ethics is that people have lots of associations with the word value, and that includes value in an economic sense. And I think that a lot of these definitions of value, or some of them anyways, have been imported into ethical thinking without really being put into question. Because like in economics, there's this idea that whatever has value, the more of it, the better.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of implied, we want to increase GDP, we want to increase economic value. It's almost like a given, whatever is good, the more of it, the better. This is actually this was one of my initial motivations for starting to write this new book, was that I disagreed with some of the ways that people thought about value. And so to elaborate on this idea, you can reduce experiences in an ethical sense to things like happiness and suffering. There may be lots of other things that people care about that they value, but I would argue that many of the things that we value actually come down to happiness, including things like knowledge and beauty and art. We appreciate these things because they give us pleasure. If we didn't appreciate them, if they didn't give us happiness, we probably wouldn't value them. But then there's a distinction between striving to create more bliss, more happiness in the universe, and responding to the call to action of suffering. And this is where there are differences of opinion, within the network that the community of people that I interact with that are very involved in philanthropy and guiding decision making. I take the view that there's something unique about suffering. Suffering cries out for action. And I don't believe that you can logically balance it out by adding happiness. Now, I don't mean that in a personal sense, because obviously we all put up with some suffering because we want to be happier, and sometimes we'll experience delayed gratification or do things we don't really want to do. And there are lots of other examples. But some of the thinking around impact uses numbers in ways that I don't think are rationally justifiable. The idea that suffering can be represented by negative numbers, that happiness can be represented by positive numbers, and if you have enough happiness, it balances out the suffering. I don't think that's logical. I don't think that's a correct use of numbers. And this idea was as I said, this was one of the initial driving points for wanting to write this book, because I wanted to explore what really makes sense in an ethical theory, and what are some of the assumptions that have gone into a lot of ethical thinking that I think are not justified. And so that was one of the purposes of the book, to think a little bit more about the concept of value, and the kind of value that we appreciate when we experience it, and the value that actually has a need to be created. And one of my arguments is that the only real need there is to reduce or to prevent suffering. And again, that doesn't mean that happiness doesn't have value when we experience it. And also, happiness can be very valuable as a way of reducing suffering. It contributes to overall well-being. The happier, the more blissful experiences we have, the more we spend time with friends, the less pain, any pain that we might be experiencing influences our well-being. So there are very concrete ways where happiness does actually reduce suffering. But it becomes a different issue when we talk about our priorities. And is it more important to try to address suffering? And when I talk about suffering, I mean, really the worst kinds of suffering, the torture of animals on factory farms, or humans who are in pain and can't get effective medications, and other less tractable causes. Should those things have priority, or should we just be trying to replicate the situation that we already have on our planet right now, and fill the universe with similar kinds of situations? And I would say, let's address suffering first, and then if we can fix things here, then we can think about trying to expand the number of sentient beings. I think right now the situation on the planet is not something we would ideally want to replicate, just because of the huge amounts of suffering that, going back to what you were saying before, people don't necessarily want to empathize with. And why don't they want to empathize? Getting back to your question, I think it's just it can be overwhelming. It can be overwhelming to come to terms with the degree of suffering that other sentient beings experience.
This concept of value is so important, and I'm glad you started this conversation, and I'm going to be thinking about it a lot. I know with NGOs and philanthropic work, there's always this need to quantify how much good every dollar or every unit of currency is offering, and you want to put your money in the best place. And so we need these metrics, and some things are not measurable, or at least we don't know how to measure them at this point. So organizations want to do something, they want to do good, and so they end up fitting into the framework that they've been given in order to do something. But it's all about framing. And I'd say about half of your book is talking about definitions and different approaches people have to framing how we approach ethics. And it was interesting for me because I don't normally read about ethics. And one of your goals was to make it understandable and readable. And I think you achieved that. I found it very readable. In fact, I read it very quickly because I wanted to get to this, our discussion. I need to go back and sit with some things to totally incorporate it. But there were lots of wonderful concepts, and all of humanity needs to learn how to think better. We're socialized, we've got culture, we've got all this mythology we believe in, and at some point we need to see the reality and truth, and I think that would help.
Well, I'm glad that you found it readable. I was in a sense addressing two different audiences, and
that's not easy.
No, well, I mean, either you reach out, you manage to attract both, but there could also be a risk of not really appealing to either. My initial audience when I started writing the book, the initial audience I had in mind was members of the effective altruism community that I'm part of, who we're all basically trying to do good with the resources available, but might have different ideas about the underlying values and what matters. So that was sort of my first audience. I'm hoping to appeal as well to academic philosophers, even though I don't write in a typical academic style, and it's not as highly referenced as you might expect from a purely academic work. But then, I'm hoping to appeal to people who don't necessarily have a background in philosophy, who are just interested in thinking about what matters. So yeah, I've been hoping that that the book would be perceived as readable, and it would appeal to an educated readership of people who care and want to think more about these basic questions. And but getting back to your question about framing and the framing of impact, and how NGOs might find themselves having to sort of adjust the way they represent their metrics. I mean, ultimately, we do need to have some way of measuring what matters. If we measure the wrong kinds of things, we can end up actually doing things that are counterproductive. And that is, that's why one of the key issues of my key themes of the book is is ensuring that the map matches the territory, and that the numbers we use actually represent the things that matter. So, I think we can represent suffering with numbers, but we shouldn't imagine that lots of people suffering from minor headaches is the same thing as one person suffering the agony of torture. Yeah, and this applies to NGOs as well, that maybe not be measuring suffering directly, we'll be measuring something else that might eventually correlate with suffering. But I would say that in the end, the key thing that we need to be striving for is to reduce suffering on the planet. That doesn't mean that every intervention will be proven to be impactful. I think some of the most ambitious interventions or projects might have relatively little evidence base, but we need to sometimes take risks, to affect systemic change, to do things that are creative and that other people are not doing, and that have a chance of inspiring people, even if we can't point to huge successes in the past.
And that just adds to the challenge. Now, I'm a vegan. I've been a vegan for 35 years and vegetarian for longer. And the foundation of my work has been to reduce pain and suffering. Certainly with veganism, I connect it with healthier eating and things that are gentler on the environment, in addition to eliminating horrific cruelty to animals. But in doing so, it opened my eyes, and my eyes continue to see things because of that step I took. And I know other people feel the same way, and that's a good thing. And that's one of the things that I enjoyed about reading your book, because it helped me see things differently, which we all need to do. We need to be open to things we don't even think about. So there's that. Thank you for that.
Going vegan raises all kinds of questions. I mean, maybe you want to ask me something more specific about that, but definitely people have different ideas about what the purpose is of being vegan, and the big question of whether it's better to seek purity and avoid any kinds of animal products, or whether one should be focused really on maximum impact. And the question is, what happens when these two goals collide?
Yeah, you do talk about that in the book, and I enjoyed that conversation as well. There's a lot of good stuff in there that people would enjoy reading about. I want to talk about a couple of things: non-existence and antinatalism. So let's start with non-existence. I've had many conversations with people, and we talk about humans and how awful we can be, and the horrific cruelty, and that life is about suffering, depends on the range of it. And should we really exist? And now with global warming and all the disasters that are happening, a lot of people say, well, maybe it's better that we do wipe ourselves out. And a lot of people have a hard time with that, because there's something in our DNA that says, of course, we're supposed to exist. We're like the best things that ever happened. And I want to dig into this, but first I want to ask you about, how do we know that there's nothing else before birth and after death? I'm not a religious person, but there's so much that I don't have any comprehension of that goes on in life, that, how do I know that there's not something before and after?
I'll have to claim that that's beyond my range of expertise.
Of course.
No, I mean, I guess in some ways we don't know. I would just say that maybe it's best to base our decisions on things that we do know, and also exercise a certain amount of humility about the possibility of there being things out there that we don't know. Yeah, I mean, there are ideas out there, including from some pretty intelligent people, that our whole world is actually a simulation on some.
I think about it all the time.
I mean, I don't personally believe that. I don't think that the arguments for that are as airtight as some of the proponents suggest. And I think it's actually just a simpler explanation that what we see is what we get. I mean, but I mean, just the idea that hypothesis is taken seriously by some people who have some pretty, let's say, are not stupid. It suggests that there are a lot of possibilities about existence that are at least worth contemplating, and that things might be a lot crazier than we think.
We just don't know. And then the other thing is not bringing more children into the world. I know I made that decision very young. I recognized that there was a lot of suffering, and I knew that there would be no guarantee that anybody that I created was going to have a happy life or a life full of suffering. And I just didn't want to take that risk. So I made a decision not to have children. We have a lot of problems on the planet now due to overpopulation. So let's talk about that.
So that ties in with the larger question of existence versus non-existence, and how do we think about existence, and is non-existence the problem? And well, actually, there's a section in my book, as you know, where I title it specifically that non-existence is not a problem. But that's a very counterintuitive thought. And I mean, just to give you an example, a few hours ago, I was going for a walk very close to where I live, just outside of central Athens. Beautiful sort of suburban countryside area right next to a mountain, with views of the sea. And it was beautiful. It was a beautiful sunny day, and I was listening to some great electronic music that I like. And I was thinking, yeah, I'm really enjoying myself now. This is I would be a very happy person to experience this every day. And I can imagine that people enjoying similar kinds of experiences would think, this life is fantastic, and okay, there's some suffering out there, but that goes along with it. It's really a matter of whether one is willing to empathize with the people that are having entirely different experiences. Whether just the news coming out of Ukraine, which is it's just one example, but it's very much in the news and it's very present. And without depressing people by going into the details, it's pretty horrific. I would never want to exchange places with somebody like that, or with a cow or a pig or a chicken on a factory farm that spends its life in misery. So you can ask the question: Does existence and the bliss of some people justify that the suffering that others experience? And there's also the idea of how do we think about non-existence? Is that a problem in itself? If we look at an empty planet that doesn't have any life on it, is there a need to fill it with life? I mean, okay, Elon Musk would like to colonize Mars. Okay, you could ask why would you even want to do that? We've got this planet here that is perfectly suitable for life. It's got water, it's got the right temperature, and we haven't done a very good job of figuring out how to live peacefully on it. Why would we want to go to an inhospitable planet and try to fill it with life? That's more of a practical issue. But at a more philosophical level, there isn't an inherent need to fill the void of non-existence with sentient life. And that doesn't mean that sentience is a problem. And of course, once we exist, it's a whole different situation, because we want to thrive, and reversing the situation would mean potential destruction, and that's not a very appealing solution, and it would be highly counterintuitive, and we wouldn't get very far even if somebody wanted to. That's not a viable solution. The question is, how can we deal with things adequately given the situation that we've essentially inherited? And then sort of talking more specifically about antinatalism, well, that is one response to the situation that we're in. And I think it's a very rational response that we can, if we can find other ways to be happy than by having lots of children, there are other ways that we can satisfy the needs that children fulfill and potentially have more impact in the world by doing that. That doesn't mean that I think that the most important thing to do is to tell everybody not to have children. I think people have the right to have children. I think it's worth reflecting on that. I think it's a decision that does require reflecting on. And in any case, in the short section of my book where I discuss antinatalism, I suggest that if one decides to have children, one should take every measure possible to minimize the risk of them suffering, and also to instill in them compassionate values so that adding them to the planet will actually have some sort of impact, so that they might be let's say, more sensitive to suffering and more willing to make a difference themselves.
I come to this first for non-human animals. That was how I got started on my whole activist path. And I really would like to see the end of industrial farming of non-human animals for food. Okay, that's always been my number one thing. And also, unfortunately, a lot of humans are exploited and suffer as well. And it would be nice for all that urgent, horrific suffering to go away.
Mm-hmm.
But do we need to suffer? Is that like part of the human condition? And it's a two-sided question, because there's so many stories about how utopia is boring.
That's a very good question. I mean, I think a lot of suffering is rationalized after the fact. So people go through awful experiences that they probably wouldn't want to repeat. Mm-hmm. Certainly, if you ask them at that moment, they would say, no, nobody should ever have to experience that. But once you've gone through it and you're a survivor and you feel the relief of the suffering being behind you, then it's a lot easier to thrive. It depends on what you've actually experienced. But we create meaning for ourselves through the experiences that we have, and we see meaning also in suffering that we've experienced. And I think that's a very valid, let's say, coping mechanism or way of making sense of our experience. But at the same time, I think it would be irrational to use that as a justification for perpetuating suffering. The idea that life would be boring if we didn't have suffering, well, it's clear that making through a challenging situation and coming out stronger, we might feel good about ourselves afterwards, but that doesn't mean that the suffering is necessary. I think we can have perfectly meaningful lives without experiencing a lot of suffering, and I think it's a bit of a myth that we tell ourselves that the suffering is necessary. If you think about all the beautiful experiences that we can have, they don't necessarily involve suffering. Spending time with people that we care for, connecting with other people, and going for walks in nature, and I can rattle off a whole list of blissful.
I'm not going to argue with you, but sometimes we need contrasts in order to appreciate the good, and and maybe good is not the right word.
There's something to be said absolutely for contrast, and I'm not saying that I would necessarily want to absolutely eradicate all suffering. I really do put a focus on extreme suffering. The organization that I founded is the Organization for the Prevention of Intense Suffering. I think there's lower level suffering that we put up with, and it's just not that bad. We're still happy to be alive, and even when we experience it. Suffering, even though this is another question of semantics. All suffering has something in common, which is the fact that at the moment you would actually prefer not to be experiencing it. I'm putting voluntary suffering in a different category, because if you could avoid it, then it's not really suffering in the same sense. So all suffering has this aversive quality to it. But at the same time, there's a very big difference between stubbing your toe and being tortured. And so I really try to focus on the things that are just, really near the extreme end of the scale, where we don't need a contrast with that in order to derive meaning.
You came up with a type of framing that you call X and U plus. Now, you spent many pages on getting to this, and I can't expect you to give us a complete explanation, but maybe you could give us an idea of what this is.
Sure. I talked earlier about consequentialism, which is basically measuring the value of an action by the impact it has. Typically it would be about whether an action is good or bad, but I don't use that framing, but it means basically that impact matters. And utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism, which typically focuses on something like utility, which, at least in one variation, is a matter of well-being. Does it increase happiness? Does it decrease suffering? And it's a very popular framework, especially within the community that I'm part of, because it lends itself to mathematical calculations, and it's based on these core things that matter to people and animals, being happy and not suffering. So that's sort of a starting point. Because I focus on suffering, and I think that suffering has a different kind of quality that needs to be addressed that creating happiness doesn't. I use the term, the N refers to negative utilitarianism. That's a term that was coined in the middle of the 20th century. And it's not a very good term because it sounds like it's the opposite of utilitarianism. And really what it just means is that, that we focus on the suffering because suffering has a call to action. The X is something I added more recently. And the X is basically what I was just saying before, is that, let's focus on extreme suffering and not get distracted by things like pinpricks and specks of dust in the eye, the kinds of things that people will use as sort of counter arguments against negative utilitarianism, things that really are trivial and don't matter, because people care about suffering not because of these minor forms of suffering, but because of, let's say, torture level suffering. And then I added the plus. Well, I already put the plus in my first book. I had the idea that if negative utilitarianism suggests that it would be better if there were nothing, well, we can put in a clause that says, well, yeah, we can still respect the human desire to thrive and to derive meaning from life and to be happy. And so I added that plus as a way of modifying this focus on suffering. And I develop it in my new book. The book is the Tango of Ethics, and this is really the core idea, that there's this striving for balance between these two very different motivations or ways of being in the world. So from a more detached perspective, we might say, well, the suffering is what really matters in terms of action. Let's focus on that, because there are things that should really just never be allowed to happen. And, we should be devoting our energy to have as much impact on that as possible. But then the plus is saying, well, we're also human beings who have this need to enjoy blissful experiences and to just feel like human beings and not just agents of damage control on this crazy, flawed planet that we live on. What I've tried to do is reframe ethics where we're not trying to find an external balance in the world between happiness and suffering. In other words, there's no ideal amount of happiness that will balance out the suffering, like I was saying earlier. My whole point is really that the balance is to be found within us. How do we find a balance between these two contrasting urges that we have to just live like normal human beings who enjoy all the sublime experiences that are possible, but also respond to the urgency in the world? And And I do think of them as being on different levels. It's not like there's some magic ratio between them, where between happiness and suffering, where everything balances out. It's really a matter of how we reconcile these two needs within ourselves, or let's say the need that is external to ourselves that we respond to, and the need we have to live more intuitively and give ourselves some space to thrive without feeling guilt for not doing more in the world. And yeah, this metaphor, I find it very useful because it applies to different aspects of ethics, and I think to life in general. The yin and the yang, the digital mode where we're running algorithms and trying to optimize, and then the more analog mode where we're not using our rational capacities in the same way, and we're just being present in the moment. Instead of searching for some optimal answer, it's basically saying, okay, it's a dance, and it's not even clear who is leading. Okay, we start off as intuitive human beings, but then, we think more about the world and we think, oh, it's important to have impact. And, maybe the world's a lot worse than we would have thought. And so then we might take on this more rational mindset, but we still find ourselves being pulled back to the human being, the intuitive side of ourselves that lives in a different kind of way. I think maybe I'm not expressing this so well, but it's really two aspects of what it means to be human that somehow need to be reconciled. And I think of this as an authentic way of framing the issue of ethics, is how do we live as human beings? How do we live in integrity with ourselves and also respond to the urgency outside of ourselves?
Well, we certainly would love our politicians to delve a little bit more into these concepts, because clearly they're making a lot of decisions for a lot of us, and they're really not based on anything useful. But I don't want to go there right now. Can we talk about, in just a few minutes left, your work at the Prevention of Intense Suffering?
Sure. So I founded OPIS in the middle of 2016. And the idea was, okay, I'd written one book. I didn't have any initial intention of writing another book. Even though I really enjoy writing and putting my ideas into words, which I sometimes do better than when I'm expressing myself spontaneously with speech. I like the idea of trying to nail down concepts and express them as clearly as I can. But I thought that, okay, maybe I could have more impact by actually trying to have impact in the world by doing advocacy work and putting the ideas into action. And I'd had the idea of, for several years actually, of setting up an organization. And with the support of some close colleagues with very similar ethical views to mine, I created OPIS as an association officially based in Switzerland. And we call it a think and do tank, because the idea is to reflect on ethics and how to put ethics into action, and then actually executing the ideas that we have. My initial idea was actually that we would focus more on non-human animal suffering, just because of the extent of it. But as things turned out, we've been more focused until now on a couple of cause areas that relate to human suffering, and specifically extreme pain in humans. And that was partly just because of opportunities that arose where there was some very obvious severe suffering with some very obvious solutions that could be advocated for. So specifically, there are many people in the world who are unable to get morphine when they're in severe pain. In fact, most of the world's population lives in countries that are unable to get morphine. And morphine is just one of the few things that actually works when people have a certain level of pain. Typically people with terminal cancer pain. And when I say morphine, that also refers to other opioids. And yeah, there's a fear that people will become dependent and develop addictions, and there's also a fear that it will be diverted to the black market.
Huh.
And the opioid crisis in the U.S. has led to a lot of unfounded fears in the U.S. as well as in other countries that giving opioids to terminal cancer patients will, or to other patients, will cause them to be addicted or lead to other problems. And it's just, there are different problems here. I would just say that in the US, what's happened is that people who really need opioids, and not only terminal cancer patients who have trouble getting them, but also people who've been on opioids for chronic pain, find themselves unable to obtain opioids anymore and end up suffering severely. And that's all been a response to opioid overdoses, which are basically due to people getting drugs on the black market and not knowing about the purity and then overdosing on fentanyl. And there are better solutions to that than just making opioids unavailable altogether. And this fear of opioids is one of the reasons why opioids are very difficult to get in many countries. So just to make a long story short, we've been focusing on that, at least initially. And we had a collaboration with a palliative care organization in Burkina Faso in West Africa. We had a conference there with the Ministry of Health, and we helped to launch a palliative care program in the country, which involves the production of morphine. And little by little, we expect that many more people will be able to get morphine there in the country, so that at least if they're faced with terminal cancer, they can at least live the ends of their lives without pain. And more recently, we've been focusing on another issue also related to pain, which is cluster headaches, which despite the name, which can sound perhaps a bit benign. I mean, headaches are not something most people take very seriously, but it's actually one of the most excruciating conditions known to medicine.
Wow.
It's also has the nickname suicide headaches because people with this condition are regularly killing themselves because the pain is just so intense. There are medical solutions, but they're far from ideal. They don't work for everybody. I can't stress this enough. It's just horrible to read about what these patients go through. I mean, I wouldn't wish this on anyone. It turns out that certain psychedelics are very helpful, and many patients have reported dramatic effects by taking magic mushrooms. And there are other psychedelics that have also been found to be very effective, like LSD, like DMT, which can cause headaches to be aborted within seconds.
Wow.
But of course, there are legal barriers. In most countries, these are strictly illegal. So we've been advocating for better access through the medical system, but also that nobody should be prosecuted for obtaining these substances to relieve their own pain. And so this is ongoing work that we're doing also in collaboration with a few organizations, including in Canada and in Finland. But our larger goal is to promote the ethics themselves, because at least in theory, if governments will take suffering more seriously and look at all the implications for an ethical framework that focuses on suffering, then all the various different ways that suffering can be addressed might be taken more seriously. And so it's sort of, I feel like it's a kind of a higher level approach. But the idea is still that the ethics will play out in terms of addressing all these very specific causes, which include access to morphine, relief of cluster headaches, ending of factory farming, and many other specific causes of suffering, which any government or politician that takes these ethics seriously would then look at all the different ways that they can take effective action against suffering. And I think there's a lot to be said for promoting these ethics and making a compelling, rational, and emotional case for addressing all the different forms of extreme suffering with the urgency that they deserve. And you were saying earlier that it seems that what I'm doing is a bit unusual. I would like to think that OPIS is a different kind of organization that is, rather than just focusing on one specific area, hopefully we'll have some success in promoting the values themselves and how they play out.
I hope so. So the Organization for the Prevention of Intense Suffering, you can find that at preventsuffering.org. And for more information on you, Jonathan Leighton, we have jonathanleighton.org. And we've been talking about your new book, The Tango of Ethics, Intuition, Rationality, and the Prevention of Suffering. If any of this conversation has been intriguing to you, there's definitely more that you can dig into in this book, The Tango of Ethics. So, Jonathan, I'm so glad that you exist. Thank you for your thoughts and for your writing and for spending time with me today.
Oh, thanks so much, Karen. It's really been a pleasure talking to you, and yeah, having an opportunity to reach out to your listeners and tell them about these ideas. Hopefully, some of them will resonate.
Indeed. That was Jonathan Leighton, the author of The Tango of Ethics, Intuition, Rationality, and the Prevention of Suffering. There is so much food for thought to digest in this book, and I do hope that many of you pick it up and read it and start thinking about so many of the concepts that are presented in this well thought out book. We need to be more open-minded and consider so many approaches to ethics to ultimately prevent and alleviate suffering, at the very least, extreme suffering. It's been another episode of It's All About Food. Thank you for being there. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening. I'm Karen Hartglass. You can find me at responsibleeatingandliving.com. Please send your comments and questions to me at info@realmeals.org. Have a delicious week.